Hello, I'm Michael Hryschenko, and I'm the author and narrator of the Democracy Undecided channel, which explores democracies through simplicities, what democracies really means, and why they never settled. With this chapter of our academic journey, we are starting the new cycle of publications, frameworks, and episodes intended to answer the question why political regimes drift and eventually fail. We will consider and derive in this cycle the societal needs hierarchy, country transactional model, and review aspects of internalization and externalization, which are leading political regimes to stability or failure. This presentation is the part one of the Beyond Democracy series, and it introduces Hryschenko's societal needs hierarchy, a structural model explaining how societies coordinate at scale, remain stable, and fail under stress. The purpose is not ideology or regime ranking. The main purpose here is structural clarity. Exactly why systems drift and why extreme regime fails. This part one establishes the base structure, the societal needs pyramid, the scale in logic from individuals to societal needs, and how unmet needs distort higher functions. In the later parts, we will extend this into failure modes, drift pathways, and externalization dynamics. The question we are solving is simple. Why do political systems become unstable regardless of ideology? Today is not a debate about values. It is a structural model. What must exist for coordination to function well at the scale? Societal needs hierarchy draws inspiration from Maslow's core insight, which is higher order functions become possible only when lower order conditions are satisfied. But we do not apply Maslow's to states directly. We use Maslow only as an individual level analog. Then we derive an independent societal level hierarchy. From here forward, every claim is about capacity, constraints, and failure propagation, not moral judgments. This is the core pivot. Most political analysis starts too high. Regimes, elections, leaders, ideologies. But regimes in reality are outputs. Stability depends on whether coordination is structurally possible. Societal needs hierarchy defines the order-dependent societal requirements that must be satisfied before any regime can function non-coercively. Democracy equilibrium framework, the previous cycles of our academic journey, explains democracy once coordination exists. Societal needs hierarchy explains the conditions that make coordination and later democratic equilibrium possible at all. So we go beneath regime labels and build the structural baseline first. This series is structured deliberately. Part one today that we are discussing, the societal needs hierarchy, so the coordination foundation. Part two, which we will cover in the future, relevant to the failure modes by layer, what breaks, and when each layer needs are unmet. In the part three, again, which we will cover later, we'll cover how failures interlocked and translate into drift pathways. And in the part four, we will talk about new concepts that I'm calling internalization and externalizations, meaning how internal imbalances projects outward from the state into conflict behavior. So today is structure first, then we move into the diagnosis. So this is the governing claim that we have. Regimes remain stable only when societal needs are met and when system behavior stays aligned with the reality. Extreme regimes can look stable temporarily, but that stability is often substitution, like coercion, ideology, externalization replacing missing internal functions. So societal needs hierarchy helps us see which function is missing, what the substitution looks like, and why the substitution eventually fails. Before we talk about societies, collective coordination, and states, we need a baseline. States do not act, institutions do not feel, people do. So we start with the original Maslow hierarchy, not as psychology trivia, but as a functional model of individual behavior under constraint. Maslow's insight was simple but powerful. When lower needs are unmet, higher behaviors do not disappear. They become distorted, performative, or destructive. A person without safety does not meaningfully participate. A person without livelihood does not plan long term. A person without dignity does not trust rule. Notice something important here. Every level corresponds not just to a feeling, but to a role individuals can play in society. Worker, citizen, participant, contributor. Maslow is used here as an analog to show a structural rule. When lower needs are unmet, higher behaviors do not disappear, they degrade. This is why Maslow matters for political analysis. We are not doing psychology or policy prescriptions. We are extracting coordination principle. Unmet foundational conditions distort higher order behavior. What we will do next is scale this logic up carefully from individuals to millions of people interacting simultaneously. When the same met and unmet societal needs are shared at the scale, coordination itself changes. That is where states and the state failures emerge. In the previous slide, we looked at Maslow's original hierarchy in its simplest form as a way to understand individual behavior under constraint. But for our purposes, that version is not enough. When Maslow later expanded his model, he introduced two critical ideas that are usually ignored in political analysis: autonomy and self-transcendence. These are not abstract psychological attributes. They define whether individuals can function as citizens rather than subjects. Cognitive autonomy determines whether a person can understand choices, evaluate information, and exercise agency. Self-transcendence determines whether individuals can sustain contribution beyond immediate self-interest to community, institutions, or the state itself. What matters for us is this: each layer corresponds not only to a need, but a functional role in the society. Worker, again, participant, citizen, contributor, and on. This is the bridge point. When these same needs are unmet at scale, individual's behavior does not average out. It synchronizes. And when behavior synchronizes across millions of people, needs stop being personal and become structural. In the next slides, we will show how these individual layers aggregate into collective demands and how those demands become state functions. Thus, we use Maslow's extended hierarchy because the simplified version misses layers that matter politically. In particular, cognitive autonomy, agency, and later higher order layers help explain why participation becomes symbolic, why legitimacy can hollow out, and why identity becomes compensatory under stress. This matters because at the scale, these individual constraints don't remain personal. They become structural pressure that force institutional. Before we move into the societal needs, we need to pause and look carefully at individual needs. Maslow's hierarchy, especially its in extended form, describes not aspirations, but functional requirements for stable human behavior under constraint, rather than aspirational goals. People in its mass must survive, feel safe, belong, experience fairness, experience agency, and find meaning before they can coordinate rationally. The key move we make here is scaling. Individual needs do not disappear when population grow, they compound. When millions of people share environment and the same survival, security, or economic needs, those needs can no longer be satisfied privately. Higher level coordination becomes mandatory. This is where the state emerges, not a design choice, but as an emergent coordination response to scale human needs. From this point onward, we treat the hierarchy as non-negotiable, order-dependent, and failure-propagating. If a lower layer fails, higher layers cannot function properly, no matter how well they are designed. If lower levels catastrophically fail, the society collapses toward extremes like anarchy. In the next slides and chapters, we will show how exactly this aggregation happens and which actor carry which parts of the coordination burden. That is why here we define the mechanism. Needs scale through aggregation and coordination pressure. When millions share similar unmet needs, informal solutions stop scaling. Institutions emerge not as ideology, but as structural responses to coordination under the scale. And as such, we are introducing the scaling breach, where individual level constraints become unavoidable societal level functions. Before we talk about states, regimes, or democracy, we need to answer a basic question. How do individual needs turn into state action at all? A population is simply a large number of individuals sharing the same fundamental needs. When those needs are shared by millions, they can no longer be addressed individually. Coordination becomes mandatory. This is the key scaling insight. Individual needs don't disappear at scale, they compound. When millions need food security and economic stability at the same time, spontaneous coordination fails. That is where institutions emerge, not as ideology, not as a morality, but as a structural necessity. States are not invented first. They emerge from the forced coordination of people acting in different functional roles. Citizens generate demand for survival, security, and fairness. Business produces and distributes resources. Institutions coordinate scale and enforce solutions. At scale, institutions become unavoidable. This is the bridge from individual psychology to collective coordination, and it is the foundation for understanding state needs or societal needs, regime failures, and democratic equilibrium. Now we can introduce the societal needs hierarchy pyramid. 7 order-dependent societal layers, and each layer is a coordination function the system must produce. If a lower layers fail, higher layer cannot compensate. They distort. This is not a moral ladder, it's a structural dependency chain. Okay. We now move from strategic overview to the first concrete layer of the societal needs hierarchy. At the individual level, psychological needs are simple: food, water, shelter, energy, basic health. When these needs are unmet, all higher motivations shut down. This is classic Maslow theory. But when this condition scales across millions of people, it stops being an individual problem. It becomes a collective coordination problem. At that point, survival cannot be solved privately. Systems emerge: food security, energy networks, transport, territorial control, not because of the ideology, but because scale makes them unavoidable. When these systems fail, we observe the same outcomes everywhere in history: famine, mass migration, warlordism, and state collapse. No political system, democratic or otherwise, can function under the starvation. This slide formalizes why survival always comes first. At scale, physiological failure collapses coordination before norms, institutions, or legitimacy can even operate. Politics does not disappear, it becomes irrelevant. This is why we treat survival as a hard constraint, not a policy choice. The derived rule here is simple and non-negotiable. No higher order coordination is possible without population survival. This is also why democracy cannot exist at this layer. Below survival, behavior is driven by desperation, not consent. At this level, politics does not malfunction, it becomes irrelevant. Voice gives way to exit as migration, displacement, and demographic collapse dominate behavior. Authority becomes transactional rather than legitimate, and territorial control fragments into checkpoints and coercive zones. Below the threshold of physical survival, democratic institutions do not drift or erode, they vanish. This layer, therefore, defines a non-negotiable boundary condition. Without population-level survival, no higher order political, institutional, or ideological structure can exist. Each layer of the societal needs hierarchy defines not a policy objective, but boundary condition for higher order. At the individual level, safety means protection from violence, crime, and arbitrary harm. When people feel unsafe, fear replaces trust and cooperation. When this fear becomes widespread, it aggregates into a collective security crisis. Individuals stop coordinating voluntarily and instead seek immediate protection. This produces predictable outcomes: militas, gangs, vigilantism, or violent reordering of authority. People willingly trade freedom for security, not as ideology, but as a survival logic. At scale, this forces the emergence of centralized enforcement and control. Security cannot be replaced by norms or markets when fear dominates collective behavior. Maslow logic is simple here. When safety is absent, fear dominates behavior. People stop cooperating and prioritize immediate self-protection. When fear is shared across a population, defensive behavior compounds. This makes decentralized cooperation impossible and centralized enforcement unavoidable. Importantly, two things happen at once. Legitimacy fragments, but coercive power concentrates. Authority shifts from consent to force. This is why order precedes freedom historically. Democracies cannot stabilize at this layer. Security must exist first. And this slide formalizes what security and order actually means at the societal level and what it does not. The key point is that security is not legitimacy, prosperity, or democracy. It is a precondition for all of them. It is relevant to physical safety and personal security, predictable enforcement of basic rules, monopoly on violence held by institutions, not factions, protection from arbitrary harm. When security exists, people can plan, cooperate, and accept rules. When it fails, fear dominates behavior. Thus, this layer is not about prosperity, legitimacy, participation, identity, or purpose. At scale, fear destroys voluntary coordination. Authority does not vanish. It becomes transactional. Whoever can provide protection gains power, regardless of legality or consent. Order may still exist, but it is no longer lawful or legitimate. This explains why coercive regimes often emerge before democratic ones, and why democracy cannot stabilize under insecurity. Security failure produces coercion before ideology. Order precedes freedom, not the other way around. At this third layer, Maslow speaks about the love and belonging. But in a societal context, this is not primarily about emotion. It is about participation, being included in family, community, and critically in economic and social life. Belonging at scale means having a functional place in a society. Participation requires livelihoods. People must be able to work, earn income, plan their future, and remain socially and economically included over time. Without stable livelihoods, participation becomes conditional and fragile, and social belonging collapses into exclusion. When this individual need scales across millions of people, it can no longer be satisfied privately. Participation and livelihoods become a collective coordination problem. A society must continuously create pathways for inclusion, not merely generate aggregate wealth or growth indicators. This is why the collective expression of this layer is participation and livelihood stability. At the state level, these needs manifest through functioning markets, predictable rules for work and exchange, and institutions that enable broad-based participation rather than concentration of opportunity among a narrow elite. At this layer, Maslow belonging becomes functional inclusion rather than emotion. People need a place in the economic system for work, income, mobility, and predictability. When these conditions exist, people cooperate even under imperfect regimes. When they erode, stress does not remain individual, it aggregates. This is why regimes often appear stable despite poor legitimacy or weak institutions. Participation buys tolerance. But once participation fails at scale, political pressure becomes unavoidable, regardless of any ideology. And this slide eventually defines where regime tolerance is decided. Participation and livelihoods are not about equality or fairness. They are about access. And the access means broad access to work and livelihoods, predictable economic rules, social inclusion through participation, not dependency, capacity for long-term planning. When access narrows, systems destabilize before ideology collapses. People respond in three predictable ways: radicalization, acceptance of elite capture, or exit through immigration or disengagement. At the same time, this layer is not about equality of outcomes, ideology, legitimacy, or political voice. Democracy is not required to satisfy this layer, but once this layer fails, democracy becomes demanded, not chosen. Once people can survive, feel safe, and participate economically, the question shifts from whether the system functions to whether the system is fair. This is the transition from stability to legitimacy. At this fourth layer, Maslow's idea of esteem shifts from an individual emotion into collective condition. For individuals, esteem and recognition means being respected, treated fairly, and heard. But at the scale, this is no longer about personal recognition. It becomes about whether institutions treat people with dignity and consistency. The diagram shows this translation. Individual needs for recognition and fairness aggregate into societal expectations of legitimacy. People accept authority not because they fear punishment, but because rules feel justified and impartial. This is why institutions and processes like courts, elections, statistics, and accountability mechanisms appear here. They're not technical features, they're signals that power is exercised fairly. When these signals fail, the system does not collapse immediately. Instead, we see selective law obedience, cynicism, disengagement, and democratic hollowing. The structure remains, but belief in it erodes. This is the first layer where democracy, equilibrium, drift becomes really possible. Now, this slide formalizes the logic behind the diagram. At the individual level, esteem produces voluntary cooperation. People follow rules when they feel respected and treated fairly. The scaling bridge is critical. When unfairness or exclusion is widely shared, resentment stops being personal and becomes systematic. At that point, people no longer ask whether a system is legal, but whether it serves them. When legitimacy fails at scale, institutions do not disappear. Laws still exist. Elections still occur. Courts still function procedurally. But their moral authority collapses. Obedience shifts from consent to resignation, fear, or spectacle. Participation becomes symbolic rather than consequential. This produces the core rule of this layer. A state can survive economic stress for years, but it cannot survive sustained legitimacy loss without coercion or collapse. This is why legitimacy is the hinge layer. Below it, people comply because systems work. At it, people comply because systems are believed to be just. Above it, people begin demanding meaning, purpose, and higher collective goals. This slide formalizes what legitimacy actually means in structural terms. Legitimacy is not popularity, ideology, or economic performance. It is the belief that rules are fair, institutions are impartial, and participation matters. It is relevant to trusted courts, elections, and statistics. Law perceived as legitimate, not arbitrary. Institutions serving societies, not elites. Equal rule application for everyone. Yet, it is not relevant to legality, economic performance, participation rituals, or coercion. When legitimacy exists, people comply voluntarily. Enforcement is secondary. When legitimacy fails at scale, institutions do not disappear. Courts still exist, elections still occur, laws are still written and enforced. What disappears, as I said previously, is moral authority. Obedience shifts from consent to resignation, fear, or spectacle. This is why legitimacy failure produces hollow democracies rather than immediate collapse. The shell remains, but belief erodes. This is also why states can survive economic or security stress temporarily, but cannot fake legitimacy indefinitely without coercion. When legitimacy is established, societies begin to demand more than fairness. They demand meaning, purpose, and collective direction. This marks the transition from institutional trust to higher order democracy agency. At this layer, number 5, the satisfactorily need and pressure shifts again. After legitimacy is established, people begin asking something more demanding. Do my choice actually matter? Maslow describes this as autonomy and self-respect. In a societal context, this becomes political agency, meaning the ability to understand opinions, make independent decisions, express preferences, and influence outcomes in a meaningful way. The diagram shows how individual cognitive autonomy aggregates into collective participation. People do not just want to vote or speak, they want those actions to have consequences. This is why the state expression of this layer includes real elections, genuine opposition, and peaceful rotation of power. These are not symbolic features, they are mechanisms of reversibility. When participation exists without reversibility, systems drift into illiberal democracy or soft authoritarianism. Elections continue, institutions remain, but outcomes stop changing. That is why the key focus is simple. Participation without reversibility is theater. It preserves the appearance of democracy while removing its substance. This layer explains how democracies can formally survive while functionally decaying, even after legitimacy has already been established. In the previous slide, we showed what political agency looks like structurally. Real elections, oppositions, and reversibility of power. This slide explains what happens when those structures exist formally, but agency erodes in practice. Maslow's autonomy at this individual level is not about freedom as an ideal, but about having autonomy in decision making. Societally, it is about the ability to correct outcomes without breaking the system. When people believe they have real agency, they self-restrain, accept losses, and remain engaged because they expect future correction. When that belief disappears at scale, participation does not vanish. It mutates. Voting, protest, and engagement continue, but they lose corrective power and become symbolic or emotional. This is the critical failure mode. Feedback loops stop working. Institutions remain, legitimacy may linger, but errors accumulate because nothing can be reversed peacefully. That is why systems at this layer often appear stable right up until they are not. Stability is simulated, not real. The derived rule is simple. Participation without agency produces the illusion of stability. Collapse is delayed, but when it comes, it is harder because correction was postponed for too long. This slide explains the most dangerous failure mode in democratic systems, when participation continues but agency disappears. At this layer, institutions may still look intact. Elections are held, votes are counted, protests occur, media operates, but the key mechanism is broken. Outcomes no longer change in response to participation. When people believe that their actions cannot alter results, behavior shifts. Participation becomes symbolic, emotional, or ritualized rather than corrective. Citizens stop thinking, I can fix this, and start thinking the system is fixed or the system is unfixable. This is why feedback loops stop functioning. Errors accumulate because peaceful correction is no longer possible. Stability becomes an illusion, not because nothing is wrong, but because pressure is no longer released gradually. Systems in this state often appear stable right up until they fail. Collapse is delayed, but when it arrives, it is more abrupt and more violent, because correction was postponed for too long. The derived rule is simple. Participation without agency simulates system stability, but destroys systems' resilience. Layer 6, next one, therefore represents the culmination of the hierarchy, the point at which societies either transcend themselves constructively or fracture under the weight of unresolved legitimacy and agency failures below. When agency fails but participation persists, societies do not become silent, they become expressive. As feedback loops collapse, politics shifts away from correction and toward meaning, identity, and narrative. This transition marks the move from agency to self-transcendence. At this level of Maslow's hierarchy, people are no longer primarily focused on survival, security, income, or even participation. Those needs are assumed to be largely met. What comes next is self-actualization, the search for meaning, purpose, identity, and coherence. At this level, people want their actions, values, and long-term direction to make sense together. They want to feel that their efforts contribute to something larger than immediate reward. When this need exists only at the individual level, it remains personal. But when millions of people reach this stage at the same time, it no longer stays individual. Meaning and purpose begin to aggregate. They become collective coordination requirements. This is where individual self-actualization scales into societal demand for national identity and purpose, not as ideology, but as a shared answer to long-term questions about direction, continuity, and collective effort. The critical warning on this slide is order dependence. This level must emerge from fulfilled lower layers. When it does not, identity is often manufactured from the top down to compensate for failures below. Maslow's logic here is precise. Self-actualization is not about belief or ideology. It is about coherence between values, actions, and long-term direction in lived reality. When lower needs are satisfied, individuals naturally begin asking not just how to live, but why their efforts matters over time. The scaling bridge is the key transition here. When millions of individuals seek meaning simultaneously, identity and purpose stop being personal questions. They become collective phenomena. At scale, societies require shared narratives to coordinate long-term direction, sacrifice patience, and intergenerational goals. Meaning can no longer be improvised privately. This is how individual self-actualization aggregates into national identity and purpose at the state level. A shared civic narrative grounded in real institutions, real outcomes, and credible long-term direction. One that integrates diversity rather than weaponizes it. But this layer is emergent, not foundational. When lower layers, survival, security, livelihoods, legitimacy, and agency are stable, national identity and purpose level is earned. Purpose emerges organically. When those layers are unstable, the need for meaning does not disappear. Instead, meaning is imposed or substituted. Identity becomes a tool rather than outcome. This leads to the governing rule of this layer. Identity cannot substitute for survival, security, livelihoods, legitimacy, or agency. When it tries, it becomes ideological rather than integrative. This slide formalizes what national identity and purpose actually require and how they fail. At this level, identity is not symbolism, mythology, or permanent mobilization. It is an emergent property of functioning systems. It exists when values, institutions, actions, and long-term direction align with reality. That is why the slide is explicit about what this layer is and what this layer is not about. National identity is not a substitute for material coordination. It cannot replace security, livelihoods, legitimacy, or agency, and it cannot be imposed top-down to mask failures below. When this layer fails at scale, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Identity politics replace material coordination. Meaning is manufactured to compensate for unresolved lower layer stress. Ideology captures institutions. Internal division or external enemies are reframed as unity. Importantly, these are not causes of failure, they are symptoms. But this layer is about a shared civic narrative grounded in real institutional performance, confidence in long-term national direction, identity that integrates diversity rather than weaponizes it, purpose that coordinates sacrifice, passions, and intergenerational goals, and meaning that emerges bottom-up from functioning system. This brings us to derivative rule, stated clearly further. When identity tries to do the work of survival, security, livelihoods, and legitimacy or agency, it stops integrating society and starts destabilizing it. This is why national identity and purpose can only sit at the top of the hierarchy, and why it becomes dangerous when pulled downward to compensate for what failed below. This, the seventh layer, corresponds to Maslow's highest need, self-transcendence. At the individual level, self-transcendence means contribution beyond the self. People seek to serve, cooperate, take responsibility, and contribute to something larger than personal gain. This appears as volunteering, mutual aid, mentoring, community work, and willingness to act for collective benefit without coercion. What matters here is voluntariness. Contribution at this level is not forced, purchased, or threatened. It is chosen. When this need is viewed at the societal level, it becomes a collective requirement. A society must allow people to contribute meaningfully inside the community and outside the state. That is why this layer is defined as constructive internal and external roles. Internally, it is relevant to civic contribution, solidarity, cooperation beyond obligation. Externally, to restrained, predictable, cooperative international behavior. The key point of this slide is simple but critical. Constructive contribution reflects maturity, not necessity. It is the expression of internal state equilibrium, not its cause. When millions of individuals experience stability, survival, security, livelihoods, agency, and identity, self-transcendence begins to scale. At that point, contributions become a pro-social norm. Volunteering and charity, mutual aid and informal cooperation, trust-based behavior that reduces enforcement costs, willingness to act for long-term collective outcomes. When the scaling bridge starting to play its role then, internal contribution raises trust, lowers transaction cost, and increases coordination capacity. Only after this internal layer is strong, society can afford constructive external behavior. Rule-based diplomacy, trade and cooperation without paranoia, mediation instead of escalation, predictable international conduct. Now, the inversion matters. When earlier layers fail, transcendence does not disappear, it is replaced. Voluntarily, contribution collapses or becomes coerced. Meaning is outsourced to ideology. External conflict is used to simulate internal cohesion. This is why internally unstable states often require enemies, pursue imperial behavior, or rely on permanent mobilization. External action becomes a substitute for internal meaning, not its expression. This slide formalizes the failure mode of the layer. When internal self-transcendence collapses, contribution becomes coerced or theatrical, moral responsibility is outsourced to ideology, service is replaced by signaling, unity requires permanent enemies. At that point, external behavior is no longer constructive, it becomes compensatory. Conflict is used to manufacture meaning, aggression substitutes for cohesion, mobilization replaces cooperation, and this explains why imperial or aggressive behavior often signals internal weakness, not strength. The derived rule of the layer is strict. Constructive external behavior requires internal coherence. States cannot transcend outwardly when transcendence has collapsed inwardly. External cooperation is not a tool to fix internal failure. It is a luxury produced by internal equilibrium. This slide eventually summarizes the core logic of the framework by showing how an extended hierarchy of individual needs scales into a hierarchy of collective societal needs. The model does not replace Maslow's framework. It preserves Maslow's satisfaction logic, but shifts the unit of analysis from the individual to society as a whole. At the individual level, Maslow's extended hierarchy explains how human behavior evolves as basic needs are progressively met. When physiological needs are secured, people can focus on survival rather than desperation. When safety is established, people can plan, invest, and trust that tomorrow exists. When love and belonging are satisfied, individuals become socially embedded. They participate in families, communities, and workplaces rather than remaining isolated. When esteem and recognition are met, people develop dignity, confidence, and sense that they are treated fairly. When cognitive autonomy is present, individuals gain the capacity for informed choice, responsibility, and meaningful agency. At a high level, self-actualization and self-transcendence emerge, expressed as purpose, creativity, service, and contribution beyond the self. The scaling bridge shown in the diagram represents the critical transition point from individual needs to the societal ones. When these individual capacities are isolated, they remain personal traits. When millions of people experience similar levels of need satisfaction at the same time, their behaviors aggregate into social norms, institutions, and collective functions. What is personal at a small scale becomes structural at large scale. Thus, we can see now on the societal needs hierarchy that the social needs that must be satisfied for the society to properly function. At the societal level, the same satisfaction logic reappears, but now in collective form. Individual physiological needs aggregate into physical survival and territorial integrity. Personal safety becomes security and public order. Love and belonging, when scaled, becomes participation and livelihood. Stable inclusion through work, economic roles, and social integration. Individual esteem and recognition scale into legitimacy and institutional trust. The shared belief that institutions are fair, competent, and deserving of compliance. Individual cognitive autonomy scales into political agency and participation, which means real voice, informed choice, and the ability to correct outcomes through lawful means. At the layer 6, self-actualization does not disappear. It scales into national identity and purpose, a shared, long-term civic narrative grounded in institutions' outcomes and credible direction. This is not ideology. It is coherence between values, institutions, actions, and long-term goals. Crucially, this layer is emergent. National identity is earned only when lower layers are functioning. When those layers fail, identity is often manufactured to compensate. At the top of the hierarchy, self-transcendence scales into constructive collective roles, internally and externally. Internally, this appears as voluntarily civic contribution, high-trust cooperation, mutual responsibility, and institutions that enable service rather than mere compliance. Externally, it appears as predictable restraint, rule-based international behavior, diplomacy, trade, cooperation, mediation, and restraint. Societies that naturally, through satisfaction of previous layers, reach this level do not require permanent enemies or constant conflict to sustain unity, because meaning and cohesion are generated internally rather than imposed. The critical implication of the model is directional. Higher order collective roles cannot compensate for failures in the lower layers without distortion and drifts. Just as individuals cannot self-actualize while struggling to survive, Societies cannot sustain legitimacy, democracy, or constructive external behavior when survival, security, livelihoods, participation, or agency are unresolved. When lower layers fail, meaning and purpose are often manufactured artificially and imposed from above. An external conflict is used as a substitute for internal cohesion. In this sense, the hierarchy is not a moral prescription. It is a stability model. It explains why certain forms of governance, cooperation, and democracy are structurally feasible only after foundational needs are met, and why unmet internal needs are so often destabilizing societies or projected outward rather than resolved within. Before moving forward, it's important to clarify what this framework is not. There have been many partial attempts to relate individual needs to state behavior. Some use Maslow metaphorically, some list state priorities as policy goals, others discuss legitimacy or internal stability in isolation. These approaches are useful, but they stop short of forming a unified model. What is missing in most prior work is the systematic derivation. Instead of asking what states want, this framework asks what states must satisfy to remain stable. Instead of treating Maslow as an analogy, it treats his satisfaction ordering as logic that can be scaled. This is not a psychological claim about states. It is structural claim about coordination, institutions, and failure. The originality of the framework lies not in any single component, but in the way these components are integrated into a single order-dependent system. At this point, the societal needs hierarchy framework stands independently, while it was inspired by earlier work on individual need satisfaction. It is no longer an analogy or extension of any psychological model. The hierarchy is derived from a simple principle. When large populations share met or unmet needs, those needs become a collective coordination constraints. Societies must respond structurally or they destabilize. The model is order dependent. Each layer enables the next. When a layer fails, higher functions do not disappear, they distort. Purpose is manufactured, legitimacy becomes symbolic, and agency becomes performative. This is not a moral claim, it is a structural one. This is where the framework becomes more than a descriptive hierarchy. First, the mapping is explicit. Each Maslow layer is translated one-to-one into collective societal function, using the same satisfaction logic, not a simplified or symbolic version. Second, the mechanism is named. The scaling breach explains how needs aggregate through population scale, division of roles, and institutional necessity. This is what turns psychology into political structure. Third, each layer specifies institutional outputs. Survival requires territory and infrastructure. Security requires enforceable order. Livelihood requires economic participation, while legitimacy requires trusted institutions. Agency requires reversibility and accountability. Fourth, the framework introduces a failure rule. High layers cannot compensate for failure below. When legitimacy erodes, identity is manufactured. When participation collapses, agency becomes symbolic. These substitutions are not ideological choices. They are structural responses to unmet needs. Finally, the model is intentionally designed to extend forward. In the next part, we will connect each layer to concrete failure modes, show how those failure map onto the democracy equilibrium framework, which, by the way, you can watch in the previous episodes. So, map onto the democracy equilibrium framework, identify equilibrium and instability points, and trace how systems drift toward oligarchy, authoritarianism, or anarchy. This is not Maslow for states. It is derived institutional hierarchy with substitution dynamics and drift linkages. What distinguishes this framework is not any single component, but the way the components are integrated. The model defines how individual behavior aggregates, how coordination pressures emerge, and how institutions become necessary responses rather than ideological choices. Each layer specifies not what societies should value, but what they must produce to remain stable. When they fail, substitution dynamics appear. Ideology, coercion, spectacle, or external conflict replace missing internal functions. Crucially, the framework is designed to connect backwards and forward. It plugs directly into the democracy equilibrium framework, allowing us to map unmet needs to equilibrium shifts, regime drifts, and external behavior. At the same time, we will connect it to the country transactional model later. From this point on, the hierarchy is treated as a standalone analytical model. Up to this point, we have built the state or societal needs pyramid as a structural model, not a moral one. It answers a simple question: what must exist for large-scale coordination so the societies work effectively at all? Each layer represents a necessary condition, and higher layers cannot compensate for failures below. This slide marks the transition from structure to behavior under stress. Once a system fails to satisfy a layer, it does not simply stop functioning. Instead, it adapts, often in distorted ways. Every unmet need produces a characteristic failure mode, and systems attempt to substitute missing functions with symbolic, coercive, or performative replacement at higher layers. This is where democracy must be placed correctly. Democracy does not create survival, security, or livelihoods. It does not even guarantee legitimacy by itself. Democracy becomes structurally possible only once those lower layers exist and legitimacy is real rather than imposed. When that happens, democratic mechanisms can balance power, correct errors, and stabilize coordination. When it does not, democratic forms become hollow. That balance condition is what we call the democracy equilibrium point, or DEP. DEP is not a layer and not a value system. It is a state of balance across layers, where legitimacy is grounded, agency is reversible, and participation is meaningful rather than theatrical. DEP exists only within a narrow zone. As stress accumulates, it shifts, degrades, or collapses. You can watch our videos relevant to democracy equilibrium framework or democracy equilibrium point, or download my paper on democracy equilibrium framework from Zenodo. Links are in the description. When that balance breaks, systems do not fail randomly. They drift in predictable directions towards oligarchy, dictatorship, or anarchy, depending on which layers fail and how substitution occurs, of course. Finally, these internal failures do not stay internal. External behavior like aggression, instability, permanent animus, or imperial overreach are almost always a projection of unresolved internal imbalances outwards. In the next section, we will go layer by layer and show what failure looks like at each level, how substitution mechanisms emerge, how democracy equilibrium point shifts or disappears, and how each failure path connects directly to specific drift trajectories described in the democracy equilibrium framework. This is where the model becomes diagnostic rather than descriptive. This diagram that you can see on the screen right now integrates the full logic. Societal needs hierarchy as the structural base, democracy equilibrium framework as the equilibrium dynamics layer below it. Societal needs hierarchy shows what must be satisfied for coordination to function. DEF shows how democracy behaves once coordination exists. The drift outcomes at the top, dictatorship, oligarchy, anarchy, are not ideologies. They are structural destinations when constraints fails. The judicial and legislative filters shown here come from DEF and explain how system resists drift when equilibrium exists. So societal needs hierarchy explains why equilibrium is possible at all. Democracy equilibrium framework explains how equilibrium is maintained or lost. This closes part 1 and opens the part 2. In part 2, we move layer by layer and define failure modes precisely. The purpose is diagnostic: what breaks, what gets substituted, and what behaviors emerges.